Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Alicia Alani, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to today's program titled Illuminating Architecture. This program is being hosted by the Smiley Jamaatkhana and Center. Smiley Jamaatkanas around the world are more than places of worship and spiritual search. These physical spaces are best described by His Highness the Aga Khan when he explained, quote, "These are places where Ismailis and non-Ismailis, Muslims and non-Muslims will gather for shared activities, seminars and lectures, recitals and receptions, exhibitions and social events. But they will also, we trust, be filled with the sounds of enrichment, dialogue, and warm human rapport as Ismailis and non-Ismailis share their lives in a healthy, gregarious spirit." End quote. Programming like today's is aligned with our community's long-term goals of enhancing relationships and mutual exchanges among diverse peoples, faith communities, civic organizations, and civil society. To adapt to current circumstances, the Smiley Jamaatkhana and Center has created a virtual platform to continue these dialogues. We hope this virtual space encourages community engagement and broadens intellectual horizons. We are fortunate to have with us today Dr. Nasir Rabbat, the director of the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at MIT. Dr. Rabbat also served as a member of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture Steering Committee in its most recent cycle. Today's session will be a conversation between Dr. Rabbat and moderator Khalil Pirani. Khalil is a senior architect at Kleinfelder, based in Boston, and a graduate of MIT's architecture program. He also serves as the current Mukhi Sahib of Boston Jamaatkhana. As we listen to the discussion, I leave you with a quote from His Highness the Aga Khan's 1979 speech at the Asia Society on the revival of Islamic architecture. Quote, "In my own commitment to the well-being of the Ismaili community, I have come to be ever more concerned with the physical form that the Islamic world of the future will take. The houses we live in, our places of work, the institutions that serve us, the gardens and parks where we rest, the markets, and, of course, the mosques. How will they look? And how will they affect our perceptions of the world and of ourselves? As descendants of the magnificent builders of Islam's golden age, how will we build the Islamic world of the future? Indeed, will the Islamic environment of tomorrow be identifiably ours? These are not frivolous questions. All beings are affected positively or negatively by their surroundings. But for Muslims, it is a particularly critical matter. Islam does not deal in dichotomies, but in all-encompassing unity. Spirit and body are one. Man and nature are one. What is more, man is answerable to God for what man has created. Many of our greatest architectural achievements were designed to reflect the promises of life hereafter, to represent in this world what we are told of is in the next. Since all that we see and do resonates on the faith, the aesthetics of the environment we build and the quality of the social interactions that take place within those environments reverberate on our spiritual life. The physical structure of Islam is therefore an important concern for me, charged as I am with the leadership of a Muslim community." End quote. Once again, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the program.
Perfect. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Professor Rabbat, for being with us here tonight and taking the time out from your busy schedule and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us on Islamic architecture. Thank you to the communications team on the Northeast Council for organizing this session. So at the outset, I wanted to just give a quick overview to our audience, what we're going to be talking tonight. The discussion will pretty much start with a high-level history of Islamic art and architecture by Professor Nasir Rabbat. And then we will talk a little bit about the downtime and the slow period, about how the traditions were sort of fading out in the history of Islam and architecture. And then the concerns that led His Highness to start initiating programs like the award program, the Aga Khan Islamic Architecture program at Howard and MIT around 1977, 1978. And later on, the initiation of the Historic Cities program that looks after the restoration and preservation of historic structures. And then we will wrap up by a couple of examples of Smiley Centers, such as the one in Toronto and Portugal. So I think with that, let's get started. Professor, thank you again for being here with us. Please tell us a little bit about how you got started into this field and teaching Islamic architecture.
Thank you for having me here and giving me the opportunity to share a little bit with your audience about Islamic architecture on one hand, but also perhaps about the role of the Aga Khan organizations, and particularly the Aga Khan program, which I am the director of at MIT. Initially, I was an architect, and I did not know anything about a specialization that you would call Islamic architecture. But having grown up in Damascus in Syria and having been a buff of history, I always loved history. And my parents loved it even more. So we traveled around the world, and all we did is visiting sort of like dusty mosques and churches and cathedrals and going to museums and so on. And this is like from the time I became a high schooler, because before that, my father could not afford actually taking us on travel. His career as a lawyer picked up when I was like in the 10th, 11th grade. And but I wanted to do architecture, and I think actually a lot of our audience would understand when I say that there was a huge resistance to me going to architecture, because we come from cultures that, of course, venerate engineering and medicine. And I was a nerd, and I was supposed to go to engineering or medicine, but I insisted on something artistic. This is what I thought architecture is. So I went to architecture, was disappointed with architecture, but I loved the history of architecture. And I discovered the Egyptian architect, whose name is Hassan Fathi, and who was the first person to receive the Chairman Award in the Aga Khan Award. So clearly Hassan Fathi had the same influence he had on me, on His Highness, to be celebrated the first time. I read his book in one night, and I decided I want to be a little Hassan Fathi. And for that, I wanted to do something more. So I thought, what can I do other than sort of like his interest in the traditional architecture and in using mud brick for building and so on? I wanted to do solar energy. I thought that would be the future. And I learned in Damascus from an American acquaintance that there is something called passive solar energy, where you learn how to use architecture to use the sun to your advantage. And I wanted to do that. And I had no idea what was that, where it is studied, or any of that. I graduated from the University of Damascus. It was very difficult to leave Syria at the time. And I discovered that there are few universities in America that did that. And the best of them was UCLA. And my maternal uncle was a professor emeritus at UCLA. And these two things did not come clear to my mind, except when I told my parents I want to go to UCLA, and my parents were very protective, didn't want me to leave Syria. But Dia is there, so it's okay. He will be close to his uncle. So I came to UCLA to study passive solar energy. I was doing climatology, I was doing physics, I was learning how you build buildings to orient them to follow the sun. I was introduced to computation. This is 1980, I should tell you. So computation at the time was at its infancy. And then I discovered that courtyard houses in the Islamic tradition were using passive solar energy. So I said to myself, I need to learn something about it. UCLA, as luck has it, in 1982 hired their first Islamic art historian. So I went to her and I said, I'm graduating from School of Architecture. I was finishing my Masters of Architecture at the time, and I want to do something about how traditional architecture worked. So she said, sure, I will help you in that. She became my muse, my guide, my mentor. She was never my professor, but midway, she said, have you heard of Oleg Grabar? And I said, no, who is that? And she goes, he is the professor at Harvard University, and I want you to go and do your PhD with him. And by that time, that uncle that I'm talking about, that Dia, he and I were always meeting. We were both smokers at the time. And we would walk up and down the Ocean Boulevard in Los Angeles, where you can see the ocean, but you're high above it. And we would talk about what is ailing the Islamic world. And it was the lack of knowledge. And I started speaking about wanting to become a teacher rather than a designer. And he encouraged me to do that. He was a free thinker. And I dedicated my first Arabic book to his memory. And the idea of actually not finishing with the master's and going out and building solar houses, but going on for a PhD and learning about the Islamic heritage started growing in my mind. And one day I picked up the phone and I called a program called the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture, which I have no idea what it was. My mentor, Irene Bierman, gave me the number. And someone picked up the phone from the other side. And my English was very halting at the time. And I said, my name is Nasir Rabbat. I'm a student at UCLA. I'm interested in Islamic architecture. I want to come and use your program to do a PhD in Islamic architecture. And the person answered saying, we do not do PhD in Islamic architecture. And I'm like, oops, really? He says, yes, you have to apply for either MIT or Harvard to their PhD program. And then we might sponsor you as a program. And I said, thank you. Who are you? And he goes, I am the director of the Aga Khan program. And I'm like, and what's your name? And he goes, my name is Bill Porter. Send me your work and I'll let you know if you are ready for our PhD. So I sent him the 3 papers on passive solar energy that I have written. He sent back saying, I'm sorry, you need to work a little bit harder to be able to get into the program. That got me to work really like a donkey for the next 6 months. And I produced my master's thesis at UCLA. And I applied only to the Aga Khan program at MIT for my PhD, and I got admitted.
Very nice. Yeah.
Coming here, I didn't like what the program was offering. So I went to the head of the program at the time, Stanford Anderson, and I said, this is not the PhD for me, I want to leave. And he said, come on, you're not going to find a better place. 6 years later, they opened the position of the Aga Khan career development. Actually, it was assistant professor in Islamic architecture at MIT. I applied to it and I was shortlisted. And I was the youngest in the people who applied to the position. And at that time, I had 1 chapter written of my PhD dissertation. And when Stan Anderson presented me, he said, this is a guy who came to me 5 days after the beginning of his PhD program and said, I want to leave. And now he's applying to stay here forever and ever. Of course, actually, it was impossible to predict at the time that I was going to do all my career at MIT. This is my 31st year as a professor at MIT. And here we are. So it's not accidental in the real sense of the word. It's actually a desire
Yes.
to fight ignorance about and in the Islamic world that brought me to it. And because I had come through architecture, I mean, had I gone to history, I would have done the same thing, but as a historian. Had I gone through anthropology, I would have done the same thing. Architecture was my tool to get to that notion of how should we understand Islamic history, in my case, through architecture.
Yeah, and I think Islam is full of a lot of arts and culture and architecture, part of this whole, it's all weaved together. So it's, like you said, architecture and history have to, sort of help each other and go together.
Absolutely. I mean, we are discovering in a sense, and a lot of this work is happening again through actually some initiatives that are coming from the Aga Khan organizations. We are discovering that interdependence between different fields. Like, for example, now you have more and more people, as a matter of fact, in my seminar, I had a presentation yesterday on the sonorous environment that is created in architecture. And now we have scholars, and some of them were sponsored by either the Aga Khan Museum or by the new initiative for music, scholars who are actually studying how sound functions within the architecture. And it seems to me that there is complementarity there to be seen. And of course, that speaks for something different than the way we see the world. We see the world whereby you are either a musician or an architect, but someone like Al-Farabi could have seen himself as both, and on top of that, as a poet and as a physicist and as a religious scholar.
So, Professor, just for the audience, sonar is the study of sound, right? Like you said.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's get into a little bit of history. Let's give us a high-level overview of what Islam used to have, back in the historical days, about its art, the history of architecture, the glory, that we say.
Yeah. Let us actually, for that, let us try to use images so that I can support my arguments with images. So I'm going to share my screen. I want to start from something that I consider to be important for us to understand when we speak about Islamic architecture. Islamic architecture has fueled the Western mind, or for that matter, all the minds, because of the strong influence of Western cultural production on the rest of the world, with images that combine exoticism and strangeness together, so that we have images like this one in here of the early 20th century of representation of the 1001 Night. In here we have Shahrazad. And on the right, we have one of the stories of the 1001 Night that was turned into a film at the end of the 20th century, one of the probably the most grossing Disney films, Aladdin. And you could see in here the kind of images that are in the mind of people when they think about Islamic architecture. And that is reducing it to sort of like the different, the exotic, the sort of like fantastic, the extraordinary. But Islamic architecture is a whole field of architectural production. And when it started becoming a subject of study, it was studied as framed between these two monuments that we see in here. The Dome of the Rock of Jerusalem, which is in fact the first Islamic monument, and the Taj Mahal in Agra, which is considered to be the highest achievement of Islamic architecture. So for so many people, these two buildings frame the beginning and the end of the creativity of Islamic architecture. When in fact, of course, Islamic architecture is much richer than that. And we can imagine that you can have a field of study of Islamic architecture, which these two posters are trying to encapsulate, that has buildings that go around the world, like from Bosnia and this here, to Spain, to India, to Palestine, to Istanbul, but also to modern buildings like the Dubai Burj Al Arab Hotel that you see in this image in here. So what the field of Islamic architecture and the Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture has played a major role in that is doing, is to turn Islamic architecture from a historic category where you study the past to a living category of architecture where the past informs the present and the future. And this, it seems to me, is the major achievement that we can speak about of the activities that the Aga Khan has established in different venues of architecture. And we will get to them a little bit. But the way I would like Islamic architecture to be seen is a worldly tradition of architecture, like you will see in this image of the door to the hospital of Emir Nuruddin in Damascus, which was built in 1154. We have here these muqarnas, these units that sometimes people liken to stalactite or to honeycombs that are really the product of Islamic geometric genius of the 10th century, put on top of a pediment or an element of gates that is taken from a Roman building. This is a taste that reflects the syncretism or the idea of bringing cultures together in the production of a new form of architecture, which in this case is Islamic architecture. So Islamic architecture has its mosques, like this mosque of Qayrawan, which shows the development of the first arrangement of worship. This is fairly early form of mosques with courtyard and then with prayer hall and minaret. And inside, of course, we have the mihrab and the mimbar. To the beginning of an architecture that is borrowing from Iran and Central Asia in the brick arrangement, and these have a beautiful name, these arrangements of the bricks in here. They're called in Persian Hazar Baf, 1,000 weave, because they look like textile that you are weaving together. And inside this particular building, this is the mausoleum of Ismail the Samanid, the ruler of the Samanid Empire, whose capital was Bukhara, today in Uzbekistan. And inside we see this arch that supports the dome, which we usually call squinch, is cut by this wedge coming in, which is unnecessary, but it's the beginning of thinking maybe it will be stronger structurally if we cut it with a half an arch. This is going to lead to the most developed invention that shows that the intertwining of geometry and creativity and structure in the development of Islamic architecture. And this is the element that we call muqarnas. Muqarnas is the sign of Islamic architecture par excellence, because there are no muqarnasas outside of the Islamic world. The only places that have muqarnasas are places like Armenia and Georgia, because they were part of the Islamic world at some point, and Sicily in Italy. But otherwise, you will not find muqarnas anywhere in Europe or in sub-Saharan Africa or in China, for example. But you'll find it everywhere else Islam has arrived. And of course, the most beautiful, and for those of us who haven't been to the Alhambra, make sure that before you are old and unable to travel, you go to the Alhambra in Spain. You will not regret it. Granada is a beautiful city to visit, but the Alhambra is the place where you would feel that it is so nice to belong to this culture, because this culture has an amazingly refined sense of beauty. This is what the Alhambra would induce in you. And of course, actually, India saw another summit of the development of Islamic architecture in the form of the Mughal buildings. We saw one of them as usually the one that frames Islamic architecture, or the end of it, in the Taj Mahal. But this is the building that led to the Taj Mahal, the mausoleum of Sultan Humayun in Delhi, which in its current form has been restored by the Historic Cities program of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. So this is one, again, of the benefit of the interest of His Highness in architecture, is that a lot of the Islamic monuments, the magnificent Islamic monuments, are being restored and being made beautiful again, and sort of like standing there as witnesses to that great history of Islam. But I'm sorry, did you want to say something? Because this is all I wanted to say about, if you want, the history of Islamic architecture. But here we get to the point of like, when Islamic architecture becomes a subject of study is when the Europeans discover Islamic architecture, because then they are going to call it the architecture of another part of the world, not our architecture. And the point is that up until, I would say, the beginning of the colonial period, architecture for the Muslim was not called the Islamic architecture. It was our architecture. It's the architecture that we built. It's the architecture that we think about. And then it was the discovery of the new method of classification and categorization that the Europeans brought, and their discovery of Islamic architecture and their production of the first manuals, if you want, of Islamic architecture that made it a category of study that stand on its own, and it's called Islamic architecture. Muslims did not use drawing in communicating architectural ideas as much as the Europeans did, developing it from the 15th, 16th century on.
Perfect. So I think let's get a little preview of Professor, what made His Highness God concerned, right? I think if you want to touch upon a little bit about the colonialism and the, like you called it, the top-down modernization.
I would say the most important thing about it is this aspect of architecture. And that is the way architecture is thought in Europe or in the West is that it goes back to classical origin, and it has all of these influences. It is like a tree that is continuously growing. And here you have the Greek, the Roman, the Romanesque, and then you move to the Renaissance period, to the 18th, 19th century, and then to the modern period. And here in the middle, it says American. The assumption is that it's a continuous tradition. It has a glorified, fabulous history of development that led to the achievement of today. I am using the image here on the side in order to show how that thought is translated into architecture. To go back to a classical temple form, this is a fake classical temple form. This is in Memphis. It's not the actual Parthenon, but it's a copy of the Parthenon. But leads us all the way down to the modern deconstructivist architecture of a Frank Gehry in the United States. How did we get to this story of an architecture that goes back to what is claimed to be the origin of the West all the way to the present, totally continuous? And where is Islamic architecture? It is in this dead branch. This is actually Saracenic architecture, dead branch Islamic, dead branch Byzantine, dead branch Peruvian, Mexican, Egyptian, Assyrian, and on, Indian actually. So the way the notion of a living tradition of architecture that goes back in time and that learns from its accumulated experience is missing in Islamic architecture, because we are led to believe that somehow creativity dried up with the arrival of colonialism, and that colonialism introduced modernity, and therefore modernity that we should learn about our architecture, about the Islamic architecture, is a modernity whose roots are elsewhere. So what His Highness has done is an attempt at actually telling us, look for your roots in the Islamic world and see how the architecture that is being produced today can be inspired and can assimilate and reproduce and reflect that long heritage of Islamic architecture. And it seems to me that this is the major achievement of the Aga Khan Award, and here I'm speaking only about the Aga Khan Award, is that it re-injected pride in the local architecture in the Islamic world and brought Islamic architecture to the attention of the rest of the world as a continuous rather than a discontinuous and reinvented tradition.
And I think at this time, we'll talk about the award, but let's talk about, like you're saying, it tried to inject creativity back into the designers, architects, clients, masons, correct?
Yes.
at all levels. So please
Mhm.
talk about that. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the initiation of the award.
Well, I mean, the first steering committee of the award had many of the people that I actually already mentioned. It
Right.
had Hassan Fathi in here as the person who is sitting on the right of His Highness and who is the first awardee of the Chairman Award. It had Bill Porter, the guy who told me, your papers are no good, and that got me to actually write a better paper. It had Oleg Grabar, who will become my advisor and who I did my dissertation with him. And it had, I mean, all of these people are actually people that I know, with the exception of these two individuals. The others are all friends now. It had Renata Holod in here. It had a person that we will speak about shortly, Charles Correa, and it had in here Nadir Ardalan, and it had in here Ron Lukoc, who was the first occupant of the position that I have now, the Aga Khan professor and the director of the Aga Khan program at MIT. And Renata is the Islamic art historians at Penn, at the University of Pennsylvania. This steering committee was gathered by His Highness to think about how can we revive the interest in Islamic architecture as a living creative tradition. And the decision was, let's have an award, because an award, of course, will invigorate the notion of competition. And the award started doing something that no other awards has done, which you probably know very well, Khalil, but I can explain it a little bit to our audience, which is that it said that architecture is not the work of a genius. Architecture is a collective endeavor. And there are many people who are involved in the creation of any good architecture. So the award is not going out there to celebrate the genius of the architect as other awards do, which will make it a little bit more elitist and somehow endow the whole profession of architecture with the notion of like, we know, you don't. Here, it's an architecture that says that I mean, the award is recognizing an architecture that says, I am the result of an effort in which the builder, the architect, the contractor, the roofer, the carpenter, and the patron, the person who commissioned it, are all involved in the creation of that architecture. And the recognition is to that collective effort. So there is a little bit of a social lesson as well in there in this award.
And I think His Highness's orientation, and you can expand on it more, is that the built environment or architecture is a tool to improve quality of life, right? Like you say, it involves everybody. It's like, we can say it takes a village to build anything. So please expand on that, how is a built environment or a project or architecture or building can help improve quality of life of people? If you can expand on that.
Well, I mean, we can show examples of buildings, but let me just take one example in here, just out of many that I can show. But this is a complex that was designed by the architect Jean-François Zévago, who was actually a Moroccan French architect who lived in Morocco. And after the major earthquake in the city of Agadir in Morocco, which destroyed most of the city, the government decided to rebuild the city. And he was commissioned to do something of exploring the possibility of the courtyard in creating housing that is satisfactory to the people who are used to the idea of having many of the functions of their lives out in a courtyard. But what he created is a geometric arrangement, an arrangement that, despite the fact that they cannot afford large spaces, but he did not stack them up in apartments, and he gave them access to green and to light and to sun and to an outdoor space that they could use for their own functions on a shoestring budget, and with a building that is beautiful ultimately, and a complex that somehow respects their individuality, but the most important thing is that it respects their needs and their way of life, and improve on it by providing them with better services. It's that kind of spirit that has been one of the motivators of how the Aga Khan Award was to develop. There are other projects that one could speak about, and that is something like this later project that is in Burkina Faso, and it's a primary school that was designed by the architect Francis Kéré, who is actually now very much involved in various Aga Khan activities. But the interesting thing about it is that it is trying to take advantage of the possibility of passive cooling, of allowing the air to cool the roof a little bit in the hot season. It's using local material, but and of course it's creating beauty in the environment. But what's the most important thing about it is that this is a community that could not have afforded this school building. So what the architect has done is that he went on a fundraising campaign, and he managed to fund the building of this building in Burkina Faso from migrant Burkinese in Germany. So it's the effort of the architect not only to build, but also to fund the building that he's going to build, that is being recognized in this project or in this other project, which is as beautiful. Another school in here, and it is this time in Bangladesh, and it is designed by the architect Anna Heringer, who's German, and who fundraised in her town in Germany and managed to get funding to support the building of what is not just, again, a beautiful, impressive building, but a building that takes advantage of the local material, a building that takes advantage of the possibility of cooling, again, in that opening and that overhang on top of the building, and a building that is trying to also maintain a sense of belonging to the place.
Right. And I think it gives a sense of ownership to the people of the village, of the town, because they get to participate in it. And I think same in Francis's example, right?
I think actually you hit the nail on the head. It's that sense of participation leads to sense of ownership, and there is nothing better than a sense of ownership to make people careful and caring about their environment.
And I think it takes us back to this whole concept, like you were talking in your beginning part, of bringing back the creativity of starting to think fresh out of
Indeed, and involving everyone.
And involving everyone and using local resources, right? I think
that's true. That's true. Yeah. I mean, the Aga Khan Award is actually ecumenical, is worldly. So it celebrates different directions in architecture. This is just one of the directions that is celebrated by the Aga Khan Award.
Right, yeah. So let's go to now, maybe we talk briefly about the other component or the other department of the Aga Khan Trust. It's the historic cities, right?
Yes.
I don't think we may have images, but we can talk about like what kind of efforts that program is doing about restoring historic structures. Things
well, I mean, it's if we think about this building or any other building, as a matter of fact, that has been receiving an Aga Khan Award of trying to do something to improve the built environment. Imagine what you can do when you have a built environment that is deteriorating and a funding agency that comes with a whole philosophy about building comes in and says, I'm going to try to restore that built environment to its civic capacity, to be a place that is beautiful to live in. I mean, perhaps the city of Agadir in here is one example that predates the Aga Khan Award in here, but it is what the Historic Cities program would do, is to come to a place and help that place regain its quality of life. And they did it in Egypt, they did it in India, they did it in Pakistan, they did it in Tajikistan, and they did it in Mali. So, and maybe actually other examples that are escaping me now. But these are all places where you have built environments that deteriorated or were deteriorating, and no funding, and impoverished people living in environment that are not conducive to the best potential of these individuals. And the Historic Cities program comes in to try to help through a refurbishing and restoration of a livable built environment, beautiful, livable, accommodating, environmentally responsive, and well-connected. Traffic in it is resolved, but also the idea of beauty. And I'm very much familiar with what happened in the Darb al-Ahmar in Cairo, because I lived in Cairo at the height. I mean, for a year, I was in Cairo at the height of the involvement of the historic cities in Cairo, in this area of the Darb al-Ahmar. And you could see that the neighborhood, which was a rundown, drug-infested neighborhood, has become, and I mean, unfortunately, because when the revolution of 2011 came, the Darb al-Ahmar restoration became so attractive to developers and contractors that they started invading the space after the Historic Cities program vacated the location. But the success of the Historic Cities has led to a lot of money coming in and bidding on actually taking over and developing it for benefit, for financial benefit. But the Historic Cities is, if you want another idea, that built on the notion of like you can intervene architecturally, but that's a building at a time, and now intervene in a neighborhood at a time or a city at a time. And sorry, yeah, no, go ahead.
No, I was saying it sort of builds upon this idea of sustainability also, right? Like, so let's say, like you were talking about the Al-Azhar Park and the neighborhood around it. So I think the revenue from the park, I believe, helps to revive the neighborhood of the housing community next to the park. Is that?
Well, you know that His Highness is very much involved and is very much taken by the idea of macroeconomics and the idea of microloans. And this is something that was generated by someone whose architectural side has received one of the earliest Aga Khan Award, and that is the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, that is led by, I think he's no longer with us. Muhammad Yunus, the economist Muhammad Yunus, who received ultimately the Nobel Prize, but he received an Aga Khan Award 10 years before he received the Nobel Prize. And the idea of actually empowering the people by making them fiscally responsible, by saying, you need to take part in the funding because you are going to become owners. And remember, I actually started from the idea that the best way of a sense of belonging, what is plaguing a lot of the cities in the Islamic world, or for that matter in the global South in general, is the notion that the citizen does not feel that he or she are owners of their cities. So when you involve them by actually getting them either to pay or to work for that, when they feel that this is ours, and this is something that has been achieved by many of the projects that received the Aga Khan Award and by the project that you're talking about. You said the Al-Azhar Park. Al-Azhar Park is making people pay very, very modest entry fee in order to maintain the park. But what was more important is in Al-Darb al-Ahmar, when initially the Aga Khan program was actually asking people to leave their apartment or their apartment building, 19th century beautiful buildings. They rented apartments for them half an hour away. And for 6 months, the Aga Khan organization was refurbishing that building. And then they came back to it. But they did not have to pay anything for it. And then studies of what was going on, that program run for about 10 years, realized that if they are invested in these buildings, they will end up taking care of them more than if they felt that this was a gift that is given to them. So they started creating association between the inhabitants of that building and asking them to each contribute 30% of the cost of the restoration of their apartment, knowing that when their apartment is restored, is going not only to double in price, but maybe quadruple in price. And according to the person who was responsible for that, who I talked to, no one refused to do that because they all realized that this makes them owners of where they're living.
Right, and it gives them the sense of ownership also.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I think talking about pride, maybe we go to our last segment, which kind of will talk about the Smiley Centers, which sort of have become a sense of pride for, of course, not only Smileys, but Muslims also. Maybe we can touch upon a little bit about the one in Toronto and later on in the one in Lisbon. If you can talk about how these buildings are now kind of, they are very contemporary, very new in a new environment, becoming a sense of pride for Muslims.
What, actually what these buildings are doing is something that they could not have done before the leap that happened in the re-injection of a historical continuity in an Islamic tradition. Because these buildings come on top of the realization that architecture never died in Islamic world, and that you could actually consider the Dome of the Rock to be your heritage as much as you will consider the colonial buildings of the 19th century and 20th century to be your heritage, as much as also buildings that were built immediately after independence to be your heritage. But the whole idea is that it's a continuous heritage, it didn't die. So when we get to buildings that are being built today, and people would look at it and say, what's Islamic about it? What's Islamic about it is not the form, even though, of course, one could say, oh, there is a little bit of a dome in here, a reference to a dome, a reference to a huge space under a dome, which induces the notion of the grandeur, the presence of the divine, the whatever large spaces induced. But the important thing about it is that what is not Islamic about it, not what is Islamic about it. That is, if I say this is part of my Islamic heritage today, I can actually justify it by saying it's a continuous heritage. So this is not a building that is coming from the moon and landing and saying I'm an Islamic museum. This is the Islamic Museum, and this is the Ismaili Cultural Center across from one another in Toronto. Both are built by super architects, Fumihiko Maki from Japan for the museum and Charles Correa for the Smiley Center. What the Aga Khan Award and the Aga Khan program and the Aga Khan Historic Cities program have created is that tradition, is that notion of a living tradition that can and should absorb all innovation. Like I showed you that door of the Bimaristan that took a Roman piece and put it there and made it Islamic. This is what we are seeing in here. There are, of course, other examples where, as we will see here from the Smiley Center in Lisbon, where some forms that could be associated with the interlacing arcades in Islamic architecture are abstracted to fit the modern language, but also the modern material of pre-stressed concrete that we see in here, and that created spaces of courtyard, a fountain. All of these, of course, are evocative spaces to what you would assume to be an Islamic garden. And around them, instead of an arcade that replicate a traditional arcade, it's an arcade that distills from the traditional arcade new forms. These buildings are so impressive that, of course, people would study them as examples of contemporary architecture. So what I am hoping that we are moving in, or that we are achieving now, is that tree that I'm talking about. The tree now is complete. So you start from pre-Islamic and you move all the way down to these kinds of buildings. So it's not only the pride of the beautiful achievement of architecture, but it's also the confidence of being in a place that connects you to your past.
Right.
And that your past is prideful from the beginning all the way down to the present. I feel that this is, as they say in the MasterCard advertisement, priceless.
Thanks. And I think these are also very sort of, I would say, contextual, right? I mean, they fit in the environment pretty well, like the one in Lisbon with the use of courtyard is a very like Andalusian style of,
Of course.
because of the weather, maybe the weather allows it to be a very courtyard versus the one in Toronto using a glass dome, we can call it, but now in a different contemporary language, right? Rather than
But you can see the references to the idea of what a dome would be here and here, how a modern dome could be, what the new glass material allows you to do. Because let me actually compare this. I want you to pay attention to how this glass is working to this. And this is another Aga Khan award. This is the National Assembly Mosque in Ankara. And what they have done is something, even though this is an extremely secular government at the time that did not want to have anything that resembles traditional Islamic architecture. So there's no minaret, but there's something that looks like it, no dome, but something that looks like it. But look what they have done inside. They have created a mihrab that is glass, bringing the light in. And to my mind, there is no symbology better than this to say what the mihrab is, because the mihrab in Islamic thinking is the place where the missing leader of the ummah or the dead leader of the ummah would have stood, and that is the prophet. And the prophet is light. So when you actually say that I'm going to create a mihrab that is going to bring the light in, you are bringing all of these notions of the sacred inside the space using only nature, using only a natural element. So when we get to this prayer hall in the Jamaat Khana in here, it seems to me that the same message could be gotten in here. Light is coming in. And of course, if it wasn't for modern architecture, we couldn't have had this huge glazed structure.
Perfect. I think we have some time constraints, so maybe we'll have to conclude here. Professor, any final thoughts you want to share? Or
I want to share this, and that is my question, which actually is inspired by the question that Shahab Ahmed, unfortunately, who left us very young because of cancer. So the book was published after his death. What is Islam? And I want people to pay attention to the subtitle, The Importance of Being Islamic. And that is what His Highness's organizations in general, but it wasn't articulated in the beginning. Now, of course, a lot of them are speaking about pluralism and speaking about multiculturalism. It wasn't necessarily articulated from the beginning, but it was pushing in that direction. And this is what I want our audience to leave us with. And that is the notion that Islam is ecumenical. Islam is universal. What is Islam? Is everything that is Islamic is part of Islam. So what the award, what the celebration of the architecture, what the celebration of beauty, all of those are pushing in the direction of saying that Islam is what Islam is, not what people who happen to be in positions of or thinking of themselves as the doyen or the custodian of what is Islamic would say. This is part of Islam and this is outside of Islam. Everything that is produced by Muslims or the people that say we are the Muslims producing that is part of Islam. And that is what Islamic award, the Aga Khan Award for Islamic Architecture, is transcending even its notion of, if you want, insularity and getting to being worldly, to being ecumenical, to being for everyone. And you can see it in the awards in the last couple of rounds. We have had awards in Russia, in China, in Black Africa. That is, it's spreading and it's recognizing, again, its international or its universal relevance.
And I think that's a sort of a good topic for our next session, maybe, that how these concepts are not, like you're saying, limited to Islam or Islamic cultures, right? It
No,
could
of course,
be very universal.
Of course.
For the well-being of all humanity. And I think that's the beauty of this whole, you can call it the force that has started with the award, like unstoppable force that will hopefully continue.
And it behooves us actually of learning from the positive aspects of the tradition that we belong to,
Right.
the possibility of being worldly, not to think of ourselves as sort of like either the victim on the side or the insular tradition that is protecting itself from all the influences. What Islamic architecture teaches us is that the production of beauty depended on openness, on the possibility and the ability to learn from everyone and to incorporate and appropriate and bring these things in. That's why we have this pluralism in Islamic architecture and pluralism in the Islamic nation. I mean, we are not all the same, but we are all Islamic. That's the importance of being Islamic.
And above all, maintaining the human dignity, ultimately, right? And
of course,
leaving a better world behind for future generations.
Oh, and actually partaking in the world also. I mean, to realize that we are part of the world, that
right.
and the world is ours, and we are its component, right, that we should contribute to it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you for your time. I know taking time out from your busy schedule to be with us here tonight.
No problem.
Sharing your knowledge, your wisdom.
It was enjoyable to the max, and I hope to see you sometime soon.
Yeah, maybe we should set up another topic later. Thank you so much.
Why not? All right.
Thanks. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for that invigorating discussion, Dr. Rabbat and Khalil. We appreciate you sharing your insights and enthusiasm with us today. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Smiley Jamatkana and Center virtual program.